Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to our web debate in June. So as you know, we meet once a month to discuss new issues and key areas of concern in the practice of diplomacy, particularly with a view of informing new and emerging diplomats. We organize these web debates in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. This month we meet for the topic AI for Peacemaking, New Tools and Opportunities for Mediators. So generally, mediation is considered a low-tech field. But now there is a sense that technology can offer formidable opportunities for the practice of mediation. And many of these opportunities are now discussed under the umbrella of cyber mediation. And over the last year, we've seen a number of activities in that area of cyber mediation. So in March last year, we saw the emergence of the Cyber Mediation Consortium, which consists of the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, DiploFoundation and the Geneva Internet Platform, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, Swiss Peace, and researchers from Harvard University. We've then seen over that year a number of talks and events, for example, at the Geneva Peace Week at the end of last year. Also at the end of last year, a group of students at the Graduate Institute completed a study, a capstone study on cyber mediation, which served as a very useful resource for many of the things that followed. And then perhaps most importantly so far, just a few months ago, we've seen the publication of a toolkit from the United Nations Department of Political Affairs and Peacebuilding Affairs and Humanitarian Dialogue. They launched a toolkit under the heading Digital Technologies and Mediation in Armed Conflict. And that work now continues. And in fact, the debate we're having today is very much part of this work of trying to figure out what we talk about when we talk about cyber mediation. And in particular today, we're focusing on the area of artificial intelligence. So let me tell you a little bit about how we will go about to structure this debate today. So we will begin by having a look at the art and craft of mediation to really dive into the question, what is conflict resolution and how is it practiced? We will look at efforts to bring in technology into this practice in a meaningful way. We will provide some more context of understanding of how we can think of mediation and technology together. And last but not least, we will make a few concrete suggestions to find the place for artificial intelligence and its applications in all of that. In order to do so, we have assembled an absolutely fantastic group of speakers, which I will very briefly introduce now. And it will be a brief introduction, so it will not do them justice, but just to give you a little bit of a flavor. So in alphabetical order, we have Mr. Enrico Formica, who is a Senior Mediation Officer at the Policy and Mediation Division of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs at the United Nations Office at Geneva. We have Mr. Diego Osorio, who is a Canadian expert in mediation, negotiations, and peace processes. He's a PhD candidate in complexity and institutional design at Utrecht University and an associate fellow at Concordia University, and they're specifically the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. And last, but definitely not least, we have Ambassador Milos Strugar, who is the Executive Director of the Conflux Center, a UN Senior Mediation Advisor, an independent consultant, university lecturer, writer, and columnist. Before I hand the floor over to them for their views and their perspective, let me also remind you that this web debate is meant to be as interactive as possible. So we are looking for your questions and your comments. You can post these in the chat here in Adobe Connect, or if you're joining us from YouTube, you can also post your questions and comments there. Throughout the whole debate, we will be monitoring these questions. I will then collect them and bring them into the discussion as it seems relevant and as they appear. But now, without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Ambassador Milos Strugar to give us, from his perspective, what is mediation about and how should we think about it?
Good afternoon, Katarina and everybody else. It is absolute pleasure to be part of this web debate, especially on this very sensitive, important topic, and with the understanding that we are really at the beginning of discussion on this topic. So I'm happy to be part of this, and I would like also to thank DiploFoundation for taking the lead in driving this research and development of this in this field, and especially pioneering role DiploFoundation had in all these activities which you mentioned, Katarina, in the last 12 months. As a result of this, we have now some basics established and approved by the United Nations, which is a universal toolkit, and Enrico will probably talk about this in more detail, but significant work has been done already in the last 12 months. But my intervention now will focus more on what is mediation. And this is not an easy question. First, there is no universal definition of mediation. There are different definitions. UN definition, which we are all using now, is that this is a process. Mediation is a process when a third party is assisting parties in a conflict, especially in an armed conflict, with their consent, and I would like to underline, with the consent of the parties, to prevent, mitigate, control, and resolve armed conflicts through a mutually acceptable peace agreements. So this is the UN definition, but in practice, many mediators believe that this is too narrow definition, and that mediation is actually any kind of activity which contributes towards peaceful resolution of the conflict. Sorry. I also have to mention that mediation is only one of the tools or one of the means in the search for peaceful resolution of the conflict. Probably the most popular at this stage, but in the past there were other means which were more popular and more applied in this situation. And I will just mention, I mean, first of all, direct negotiations between the parties, peace processes, but also judicial settlements, conciliation, arbitration, good offices. All these are means to look for a peaceful search, peaceful resolution of, to search for a peaceful resolution of an armed conflict. So mediation is one of them, the most applied in most of the cases nowadays. But each case is completely different. You know, and of course, we as mediators, and I have been involved in many efforts, especially with the United Nations, but also on a so-called track 2 with some non-governmental organizations in a kind of alternative mediation track. And we all study other cases. We all learn good and bad lessons from other cases. But each case is completely specific and different than the other cases. And this is what makes mediation very complex and very difficult. Very difficult to deal with in any way, and especially using technological means for this. In the last, I must admit that in the last, let's say, 10 years, mediation efforts at different levels produced very limited results, and the conflicts are ongoing, and new conflicts are, coming every day, and old conflicts are not resolved. It looks like some of the conflicts are completely intractable. So one of the reasons for this is that the nature of the conflict changed. And we don't have, in the past, when I started, getting involved in the mediation efforts, most of the conflicts were between the states. And then you can put this in the existing collective system of peace and security, which regulates the relationships between states and address this conflict in a proper way. But now we are talking mostly about civil wars. And we are talking about civil wars where you have direct link with the poverty, with the economic and social problems. Conflict is directly linked to the fragility of the state or non-functioning of the state institutions. Conflict is linked to international terrorism intertwined with organized crime and also violent extremism. Conflicts are very often civil wars, but they have a transnational implications, spillover. So there are many aspects which change the conflict, but we are now in a situation where it's very difficult to distinguish between war and peace. Very difficult to identify the parties to the conflict. In Syria, for example, at one stage we counted around 1,800 different armed groups which were involved in the conflict. How you identify all these parties, with whom you negotiate, how you bring them together. I mean, these are all enormous challenges. Then we have influence of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, driven by the information and digital technologies, but also fusion of technologies, nanotechnologies, biotechnology, everything, robotics, artificial intelligence. And that is also influencing and changing the nature of the conflict. First, this technological innovation are accessible to everyone. We are talking about new types of weapons, biological and automated weapons, killer robots. That is changing the nature of the conflict. Everybody is adjusting to this. You cannot find a classical warfare. You have a hybrid warfare, where is a mix of classical armed operations with the information operations, with the technological operations. So mediation also has to change. So definitely a mediator must be digitally literate, must understand what could be applied in the mediation. I would like to make a distinction between these two things. One, mediator must be fully aware what is happening in this field. And on the other hand, to look what can be successfully applied to help the mediation efforts. These are two different issues which I hope we can address today. But there are some, I would just, before concluding this beginning intervention, I would just like to outline some of the issues which we are facing to see how or is it possible for artificial intelligence or technological means to get, to be applied in this situation. For example, we have, in many cases, we have an issue between self-determination, normally of the minorities, and secession, and territorial integrity and sovereignty of the state. To which principle, all these principles are in the UN Charter, to which one you give primacy in a particular conflict. And there is no universal answer to this. In some cases, you will see that, self-determination has a priority over territorial integrity and sovereignty. You will see that many states, let's say just 5 permanent members of the Security Council, you will see that they apply completely different standards to different type of crises, depending on their interests. In some cases, they support secession of the minorities. In some cases, they insist on the territorial integrity of the state. It depends how this corresponds to their interests. Then you have mediators. Another key question for the mediators, and I would like to pose a question to the audience and ask them to answer with yes or no. I will just describe the situation, which is an actual situation which I faced. And I think that Arvind just put it on the screen. But basically, the point was at the time of the signing of a peace agreement after a long civil war and a very difficult negotiations with the UN mediator. the UN mediator realized that a leader, a tested leader of a terrorist group which attacks civilian population and also UN personnel, is designated vice prime minister of this new power sharing agreement between the government and the armed opposition. And the question which we faced at that moment was, should we sign on this agreement? Because without signature of the mediator, this agreement is not full agreement. So should we sign on this? If we do, then we are giving indirectly impunity to a tested terrorist. If we don't, in all likelihood, the civil war will continue with the casualties. So how you answer this? I would like to ask our audience to answer this question, yes or no, and then I will maybe come back to this and comment on this later. But just before I finish, mediators are facing different situations. For example, I remember one case where we spent 5 hours negotiating sitting arrangements. Then sometimes you have parties which do not recognize each other, do not talk to each other. How you resolve this? In one case, how we did it, we established like a tripartite commission where the UN mediator was in the middle, and each party will, and we were all in the same room, but each party will talk to the UN, but the other party can listen to this. But formally, they were not talking to each other. They didn't want to have direct negotiations. Very often we are faced with the cultural differences between the parties. For example, for some in my experience, some parties believe if we have a problem, we go and resolve this problem in any way possible. And our job is finished. You have in different cultures, you have a position that the resolution of one problem is just the beginning of another one. So you have to look to have a holistic, comprehensive view of things. Look at the consequences, impact of an agreement on different groups, on what kind of problems that can provoke. So these are all. Mediator can be useful in many ways, not just to bring the parties to talk and to reach an agreement, but mediators can provide guarantees. Because when you have parties in the conflict, the main problem is lack of trust. And the mediator can provide guarantees. For example, 1996 war between Israel and Hezbollah, there was agreement on a memorandum of understanding how they should operate, but Israelis wanted additional guarantees from the US. The US and France were mediators in this. And the US bilaterally gave them these guarantees. Mediators can also provide incentives. If you take Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement, part of this agreement was that the US will provide financial assistance to both Israel and Egypt to the magnitude of around $5 billion a year to Israel and $1.5 billion a year to Egypt. That was in 1979. They are still giving this incentive on a yearly basis to both countries to implement and respect the agreement. The agreement between Israel and Syria, which was completed but not signed at the last moment in 2000, the price tag for the US as a mediator was $60 billion for Israel, $20 billion for Syria. So there are different ways how mediators, can I have 1 minute, Katarina? I know that I'm over my time. Just 1 minute, just briefly to say what kind of technologies I implemented, but I give you a floor. Yeah.
I just said, yes, please, go ahead, 1 minute.
Yeah.
And then we need to get into the technological aspect.
Okay. So what I, as a mediator, implemented so far, of course, social media. Social media to get information, to target or to reach, to target audience of the general public, and also to mobilize support and promote peaceful resolution and the mediation efforts. Social media problem for me was misinformation, disinformation, and manipulation. The other aspect, and I can go into details about this, the other aspect which I used was mapping and geographic information system. And that was very useful for monitoring the ceasefire or disengagement of forces. But again, there is a danger of manipulation. So there is, and then data protection. That is, that's also a very important aspect which I use in all this. In all this is how to detect manipulation, disinformation, misinformation. That's the main challenge for all of us. And I will end here, and I hope Enrico and Diego can give some answers. Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent introduction, highlighting complexities, dilemmas, and really the question of which principle to take primacy, all of these really complex questions surrounding mediation. But let us dive a little bit deeper into the question of technology and mediation and how various aspects can support mediation processes. And I think for that, we don't have anyone better but Enrico Formica, who is one of the people behind the cyber mediation toolkit that has just been launched. And Enrico, over to you to give us an introduction and overview.
Thank you very much, Katarina. Not an easy job to speak after Miros, who is one of our best and most seasoned mediators, but I will do my best. Thank you very much for Diplo for hosting this conversation and also for partnering with us. It has been like a short journey, but very intense for the last 18 months, I would say, since the founding of the Cyber Mediation Initiative. I think it was a pioneer initiative, and we came maybe not a long way, but some way we did together. So thank you for partnering with us. You already referred to the toolkit. Indeed, earlier this year, the Mediation Support Unit of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue produced this toolkit at the request of the Secretary General, who is also portrayed here in the picture. Basically, to start exploring in concrete terms the impact of digital technologies in the field of mediation. Basically, to provide some suggestion about this impact in a very practical way. All the toolkit is indeed based on practice. It is a result of some of our observations, but most important is a result of a survey that we conducted with practitioners and a number of consultations with people involved in mediation, mediators and mediation support actors. You can see on the screen the page. It is hosted on the Peacemaking web page of the Mediation Support Unit. And I will not go in detail of the toolkit. You can, I hope you will, this conversation will attract your curiosity and you can explore it yourself. Just a couple of general observations. One is that indeed the digital technologies are becoming pervasive and they are touching upon the field of mediation as well, like in any other realm of life. That said, it is also clear that mediation remains what we say the human-intensive endeavor. It's not that the technologies will replace the personal contact that are required for successful mediation. But we should not fall into the trap of thinking that then technology do not apply altogether, because that is not true. And indeed, the toolkit show a number of cases in which technologies are having a significant impact. Miros already alluded to that. We also need to be careful because technologies are dual use most of the time. So they can be used for good, but they can also present very serious risk for the mediation process. And again, Miros has already alluded to some of them, manipulation of information, and so on. Now, in the toolkit, we identify some of the technologies that are already being used in mediation. And among them, I like to refer to social media, geographic information system, and data analytics. These are technologies that mediators are already using. And in the result of our survey, we also noted a growing interest on other areas, such as machine learning, virtual reality, and blockchain. So these are areas that are coming in the practice and that we we are exploring. In this conversation, it is part, in a way, of this exploration. The toolkit focuses on four crucial themes related to mediation as follows: conflict analysis, engagement with the parties, inclusivity, and strategic communication. So for all this, in all these areas, we try to highlight the opportunities and the risks of technologies, and also mentioning, without necessarily supporting, but just mentioning some of the tools, mostly commercial tools, that are available to practitioners in these areas. Now, just in the next couple of minutes, I would like to focus in more concrete terms on the subject of this conversation, which is artificial intelligence. And again, I think it's probably one of these fields that is not fully explored. So I just try to put some seed, food for thought, and for this conversation to start. My first observation is in the area of conflict analysis. The first thing that I would like to say is I think that it is important for mediator to start understanding how a system will change the nature of conflict. Again, Milos has already alluded to that, automation, robotics, and so on. So we need to understand that, because you need to understand the conflict that you want to mediate. So this is kind of a substantial type of comment. With regard to the tools that are already being used, for sure, data analytics and sentiment analysis are being explored. There are a number of commercial products that do that. The United Nations, including through Global Pulse, is developing some on its own, or basically trying to reach a better understanding of the conflict we are trying to mediate by aggregating and elaborating data through the assistance of artificial intelligence in machines. It is too early to say that data is very useful and successful, but it is being experimented. And I can refer to efforts, for example, by Global Pulse in Somalia and Uganda, and a tool called Catalog that analyzes and visualizes data from radio and social media. So two very different sources combined together through the ability of the machine to listen to the radio and to watch the social media traffic and combine it in data analytics. Or the Middle East division of DPPA of my department has been working with university, building a machine learning based system for detecting and analyzing public opinions in the Arab world. Again, this is a new example. We need to keep looking. The second area in which I would like to briefly touch upon and leave you with a question is in the area of inclusivity. Now, in addition, we define inclusivity, the ability of a mediator to bring to the conversation a broader sector of the society, broader, multiple stakeholders, and not just a limited number of parties to the conflict. Now, we believe that digital technologies provide an unprecedented opportunities to websites, social media, to reach out to broader sector of the population and to a big number of stakeholders. And we have a number of examples for this that are mentioned in the toolkit. For example, in the Colombia peace process, there was a website that was created to collect input on various themes. In the context of the Libya National Conference, again, a website collected input for thousands of people. And the same happened in Fiji in the context of the constitutional process. And what struck me in this example that we briefly examined in the toolkit is that while the technology was used as a platform to enable all the stakeholders to contribute to the peace process, guess what? On the receiving end, on the other side of the platform, were humans, a number of analysts trying to cope with this flood of information, data, unstructured data, and try to make sense of all this information, and sometimes, in all honesty, failing because it was just too much. And so the question that I want to leave with you in concluding this initial introduction is, maybe would it be possible to use artificial intelligence to automate this process and to combine the automatic collection of this data with some sort of automated analysis through technology. So that is my initial contribution, and again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Enrico, for introducing the toolkit and then starting to take us deeper into questions of AI and mediation, where mediation can support, where AI can support mediation. Let me hand over to Diego, who's gonna, I think, again, zoom out a bit and provide us some more context of how to think through, or how to begin to think through technology and mediation, in particular AI and mediation.
Well, thank you and good afternoon to you, to the co-panelists and to the audience. For me, it's an honor to be with all of you here. Let me just start by saying that I want to introduce a little bit of the perspective from practitioner, but also connecting with what I'm doing in terms of my PhD studies in complexity and systems thinking, because that has been a little bit of an eureka moment in the sense that it has revealed a new dimension. I guess the first thing is, if we consider artificial intelligence as this amazing computing capacity, we have to think in terms of making the distinction between what artificial intelligence is going to help us enhance what is by nature and by essence human-led, human-induced, human-managed processes. So with artificial intelligence, you can collect, you can compute, you can analyze things, but you will have at least a human algorithm or a human person, human brain leading on the process. That basically will give us speed, will give us outreach, will multiply our capacities, but will still be linked to the cognitive framework of those humans that are being together, linking and working on that particular process, be it a mediation, being something else. Let me just give you one example of classic diplomacy. When Viet Cong, Vietnam, South Vietnam, the Americans wanted to negotiate, as Ambassador Milos mentioned, there were some problems in terms of the city. It was about 8 months to actually get to an agreement in how people were going to sit. And from the square, they came up with a round table. And that was basically what you call Solomonic, but a little bit delayed solution. And those are the kind of things that show to a certain degree that we also have to understand from the human perspective that we have limitations. We have cognitive, conceptual, cultural, socioeconomic limitations. And that basically put us in one question. Is artificial intelligence going to be a set of tools and technologies that will help us go beyond those cognitive restrictions? Or is it going to be something that is going to help us maximize our capacity and therefore also perhaps our defaults? Will be also leading at a mediation in which we are going to conceive it from a perspective in which we're only going to be looking at the options that we have already predetermined, or will be willing to accept the fact that through artificial intelligence, we might uncover new options, new permutations, new ways of looking at a problem, for instance. And that is something that I accept that to this day, those who prone for the fact that digital technologies will not replace human thinking and the human interaction, I think today that is the case. I will not dispute that. But I think that in the future, we might be reaching the point in which, true, two robots are not going to be able to mediate, but two robots will be amazing advisors, creating and expanding the range of options that will be available at a computing capacity and in a speed that will make us either extremely good at covering the entire realm of what needs to be done, or potentially be led in the wrong direction, because use and success lead to dependency. So that is one thing, and I refer to this particular path because when we're looking at complexity and network thinking, we start to realize that those new technologies help us frame the debate in a different way. And when we apply retrospectively to things such as, for instance, there is a case on the South Sudan civil war, or even to the process of institutional changes that happen in Afghanistan, that it points to different places, different points of inflection, different solutions, different alternatives. So it makes you think, wow, when's we going to be able to properly design this and use it with the appropriate technology? What kind of outcomes are we going to have? Where are we going to lead in this direction? And I'm just going to say, if we're looking at this as a tool to solve problems, you also have to look at this technology as a tool to cause problems. So we might have really intractable times, intractable problems, and that is something that we need to take into account. I just want to say that in terms of when we look at all these technologies that have been presented, and I have to congratulate the United Nations because the digital toolkit is amazing. It's an amazing set of tools that allows basically at different levels to crack the problem, to look at options, to maximize the outreach. That we also have to start thinking in terms of this new dimension of when artificial intelligence is going to deliver beyond what we're still thinking is the maximum that it can be delivered. It was mentioned recently that in terms of data analysis, artificial intelligence could basically look at the entire set of agreements, identify patterns, identify solutions, and compare it, right? But I would just say that is, to this day, the basics of a computing power, which is it computes, it tabulates, it counts, it compares one-to-one, error against mistake, and figuring out this thing is 80% similar to that. Therefore, it seems to be possible. But if computing is going to be able to carry and to provide the support to causality analysis, it goes beyond the words, it goes beyond the comparison, but it actually takes us to the calculation of this is potentially a better solution, this is going to change things. Whether it's in a trade negotiation, and it has been used, and Katarina mentioned that in a presentation that she did at Global Affairs Canada, as she mentioned it before, the ability to capture and analyze text and deliver the best possible outcome based on the comparison is stage one of artificial intelligence is going to deliver. And the ability to take that analysis and take it beyond our cognitive framework is stage two. And we need to be prepared for stage two. Over to you, Katarina.
Thank you, Diego. Very interesting. I'm looking forward to stage two in a sense. And you're very right. We're at a stage where we see the development of some tools, but it's very much at the beginning, and we have to see how far we can push that. So I now have the difficult task of trying to add something to the three speakers who came before me, and that's indeed a difficult task. So also in the interest of time, what I will do is let me re-emphasize a couple of things that have already come up in conversation. And in that sense, it's also interesting to note because in a lot of ways we're all very much agreeing and on the same perspective here. But let me make a couple of comments by way of emphasis of what has already been said. Let me start with this. To be clear and to get everyone into the conversation, let me give a definition of what we talk about when we talk about artificial intelligence. So here it is. Artificial intelligence can be understood as the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision-making, and translation between languages. At Diplo, we started looking more deeply into AI as a tool for mediation. And what we find so far is that it seems particularly relevant for gathering and analyzing data for mediation to inform mediation. And here, to inform mediation in all phases. So during the preparatory phase, during the process itself, but also during follow-up and implementation. And this is very much in line with what we already heard from Enrico and Diego. One important thing to mention is, of course, AI is not magic. It is one tool among many, and that's also something we have been among ourselves here emphasized quite a bit. And let me also track back and go back to the practice of mediation. So, for example, if you look at the UN guidance for effective mediation, you are given a couple of fundamentals that should be considered for effective mediation. These include preparedness, consent, impartiality, inclusivity, national ownership, international law, normative frameworks, coherence, coordination, complementarity of mediation efforts, and the quality of peace agreements. And so if we take that, we can ask, so which of these fundamentals can be positively influenced by AI as a tool? And also, as Diego alluded to, many of these, and all the other speakers as well, this is many of these aspects are very much a human endeavor. So from our preliminary research, we think that when it comes to preparedness and impartiality, AI can make a contribution to these key fundamentals. So let me quickly mention two examples again that we alluded to already. So one very broad example refers to AI machine learning, and here in particular image recognition. And this is something that AI has been getting extremely good at. And so here we're talking about the analysis of satellite images and different aspects of that. So for example, movements of troops on the ground, movements of people on the ground, developments in refugee camps, the analysis of where people are actually living and what their economic and social status is. Then we also have this area of the analysis of text, as mentioned by Diego, and here we are in the area of natural language processing, where vast amounts of text can be processed, and we can gain insights from that that might reveal something to us that we haven't seen before. In one sense, it makes the preparation process quicker, so that mediators can save time on preparation and actually be present during the mediation. And we've seen examples of that already being developed outside of the context of mediation. So for example, as Diego said, analyzing peace agreements, analyzing speeches, generating insights from that. But there's also another interesting example of this, which is something I encountered at the AI for Good Summit last week in Geneva. And at the summit, they showcased something called Project Debater. So Project Debater is a tool released or introduced by IBM last year, and it is an AI that can debate humans by analyzing all the information on a topic, presenting a coherent text on that topic, and then replying to humans on this issue. And what they did there was they asked a question to the general public, and on social media they got more than 1,000 replies. And what they then asked the AI, so IBM's Project Debater, to do is to produce a coherent text out of all these inputs that were collected from the public. So in one sense, this might be very helpful in getting a sense of the opinion of the general population on a certain issue. If you ask for inputs, for example, via radio, and there the example that Enrico mentioned comes into play, it might be a very good idea to collect information and have an easy way to analyze it. But at the same time, it also really highlights the, the place where this cannot go. For example, we cannot use this to draft a peace agreement. We need humans in the same room having a conversation for that. So I think this is very interesting, where we see a lot of potential on the one side, but also very clear limitations of AI as a tool for mediation. Let me stop here. There's a lot to pick up on, which we should do. So in the conversation here in the chat, we've seen a conversation on conflict and the intractability of conflict and the complexity of arriving at a possible peace agreement. So we've seen examples from South Africa as a region. We've seen Northern Ireland mentioned. And I think with that, I would like to give the floor back to Ambassador Struga to bring us back to his example and the survey we conducted earlier. So just to remind yourself, we had a case, and I give over to the ambassador. You can introduce us better to this.
Thank you, Katarina. I'm just looking at the results. I can't find them now, but anyway, maybe you can help me, or Arvin. But the point I wanted to make with this, I see 16 to 5. 16 would sign and 5 would not sign. There is no universally accepted answer to this question. And that is the point I wanted to make when we are talking about artificial intelligence. Human intelligence was not able to answer this question. This is a debate which is ongoing in the political philosophy for more than 200 years. English philosopher Bentham, he was of this approach of consequential approach. So you look at the consequences of your decision. If this is to prolong the civil war and cause the casualties, you sign the agreement. That was the main criteria. At the same time, Immanuel Kant was insisting on a so-called categorical approach. If you have rules, you have to implement them all the time. Otherwise, you are creating chaos. And this is a dilemma which exists and is being extensively debated by philosophers, political philosophers, for more than 200 years. And there is no universally accepted answer. So I just wanted to bring this as an example to show how difficult it is to get artificial intelligence involved in decision making of any kind in the mediation process. Since I have a floor, I just want to voice, a couple of issues which I have with not just artificial intelligence, but also digital information technology. One is that it is ungoverned space. So first we have to, and DiploFoundation is doing a great effort in that regard, but so far we don't have internet governance. It is ungoverned, the biggest space with no rules, no governance. The second problem, which is for me of legal and political nature, is that most of these tools starting from social media to the artificial intelligence, are owned by private companies. So we are talking about, using private companies. Who legally owns the results or the content? Who forms the whole setup? How we prevent that we are not manipulated? If they are using big data, what data are they using? Data which is available to that company, and now we are seeing increasingly new tech Cold War, especially between the U.S. and China, and it's quite possible that we will see 2 or 3 or more different internet spaces with different data, big data. Which data you use? Then second, who formulate the algorithms, on what basis? So this is these are the main issues which I have with this, because manipulation is possible in all the aspects of all this, but also a mistake is possible. As Diego mentioned, we have to wait, there will be improvement and all this. And the last point I want to make, it's not when you are as a mediator, when you are dealing with an issue, it's not only about the positions and the needs and the interests of the parties. It is about deep history. It is about culture. And you have a subconscious part of culture. It is about set of values. You have to reconcile this. It is about perceptions about yourself and perceptions about the others and perceptions about the mediator. It is about feelings. So, everybody, every party in every conflict, even the most extreme parties like Al-Qaeda and Daesh, they think that they are right. So why they think that they are right? There is an explanation there. These are all challenges which are more in a different emotional, sometimes, I must admit, as mediators, sometimes you act on instinct. And sometimes, because you don't have parameters to make a, informed, firm decision and conclusion. You act on instinct. And that is why direct contact, human contact is a key in all this. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you again for this excellent overview. There were a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm just, in the interest of time, going to collect all of them and then point them to you for each of you to pick which question to answer and which question to focus on. First, from Vlada, specifically to Diego, but perhaps we can open this up to everyone. The question is, why do you think AI or robots won't be able to negotiate? Could they actually be better in reaching win-win agreements? Then we have a question or a comment from Laurie Amy on AI being able to monitor biochemical markers and therefore kind of getting at the emotional intractability of conflict by understanding when people get too emotional. And I've seen similar examples where there's, for example, analysis of speech and trying to find or identify emotional markers in speech and how people talk to each other. There is a comment from this Galvez on the question of can we actually analyze the political and social consequences of failure to agree, and what would be the implications of that? So, for example, could we say there will be economic loss, there will be mass refugee flows, and how would this help the mediation process? Then someone else saying that this is actually exactly what they're trying to model with their AI system. Last but not least, then questions again around data and data bias. Can we assume data is unbiased that we collect via AI or for AI? And shouldn't we be careful in relying too much on the idea that whatever a machine learning system gives us is unbiased? With this kind of host of questions, basically over to you to answer these questions and for any final comments. Let me start with Enrico. And then Diego, perhaps. And then
very much. Maybe I will pick up the question on the bias and emotional versus rational. On data bias, I think that, and was also contributing to the ongoing chat, I think conflict is the place where parties have most interest in manipulating data. So if there is an area where the dangers are very high, is precisely in our area of mediation, in armed conflict. So I think it is we need to treat this with extreme caution. Not only data can be biased and manipulated, but also I want to refer to partial data. For example, when you do sentiment analysis, very often we follow social media, but very often we follow social media in countries in which internet penetration is 20%. So what about the 80% who are not in social media? So there are a number of different bias and partial data that I think need to be considered and treated with certain care. The second aspect, there were a number of questions, one related to kind of robot mediating, artificial intelligence coming up with solutions and so on. And I think that indeed, in theory, all of this would provide a more rational solution to the problem. But in reality, my personal observation is that war is the opposite of rational. In reality, if parties would apply rational thinking, hopefully would not go to war and the calculation would be different. There are some rational elements in going to conflict, but there is also a lot of emotions involved. And that's why I still think that mediation is a human-centered endeavor that has to take into account the strong emotional components of it, which does not mean that it should be pure emotion. It means that it has to match the two things. And so I think that artificial intelligence and technologies in general can bring us these more rational mathematical elements that are definitely very useful, although not in isolation. And I think that they are very useful because they can broaden the knowledge of the mediators. We talk about analysis and so on. They can also stimulate his creativity. For example, Diego was rightly pointing out to the idea of basically for a system to study different peace agreements and coming up with a solution, which is not necessarily the solution that the mediator will put on the table for the parties to sign because it's the smartest and the mathematical perfect solution. But it is a process that will give the mediator an analysis of thousands of peace agreements that he will not be able to do alone or with his team, and will probably give him a number of smart options. And by looking at the smart option, the mediator will then apply his creativity, his imagination, his emotional intelligence, and then possibly come up with a solution that combines all these things. So it's definitely very useful, but not in isolation, or not exclusively, I would say. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to add to what was mentioned by Enrico and by Ambassador Sugar on the primacy of humanity at the center of all this. And I'm one that believes that humans should remain in control, 100%, although we don't always deliver the best result, but because it's really something that concerns us, we should maintain that primacy. I recognize that when the ambassador mentioned the categorical imperative, that's certainly a key determinant of how we really need to move forward. At the same time, what happens is you look at the interface between artificial intelligence and the legal profession, a lot of what's being done, even to the point of the creative process of designing new contract and agreement, is slowly being absorbed by artificial intelligence. So at the end, you're going to have the wizards of legal thinking that will be able to provide this creative element that nobody can do on the repetitive task. And that is where the humans are still winning 1-0 to artificial intelligence. However, we are, and I can see that now from what I've been experiencing in the scientific community, there are different people working at how can we translate intuition into machines. And the intuition is basically a highly level of computing that leads us to have the moment of creativity. And that intuition is less and less elusive to the thinking in terms of computing. So we might get to the point in which we will have to take a normative decision saying we remain in charge on this particular thing, even if the machines might apparently deliver a better outcome in many of these cases. It is also true when Lori talks about these artificial intelligence using on the interface with the biological element. Well, it has been done before. You know, when you used to take the shirts where the prisoner was sweating and you give it to a dog, you could tell if the person was lying or not. I mean, these are, for those who've been working in work, we know about the interrogation techniques and human rights abuses, and these things happen. So it's been done before, and again, computing technology will be able to enhance it, improve it, maximize it. I will also say one thing is that we really need to think in terms of the fact that not everybody is using technology in the best possible way. I'm not here to judge on one jurisdiction or the other, but certainly the fact that in Europe you have the GDPRS and for data analysis, but in China and in the United States you don't have the same kind of framework of regulation, that when you are able to throw as much data as you can into artificial intelligence, they are learning. So certain machines on one side of the Atlantic are learning faster than others, and they are delivering chunks of new products. And the third element I wanted to mention here is that artificial intelligence and data technology and internet and different types of social media work in terms of the inclusivity mentioned by Enrico in terms of the participation at the level of inclusion in a peace agreement, but it also could be part of the solution in terms of certain shortcomings when you need to include everybody in a peace process. For instance, the case of Colombia. One of the things that were mentioned is that there was an excellent peace agreement, but the process of vulgarization, socialization of the peace agreement was a little bit short of the target. And so because of that, that might have an influence on the outcome of the referendum that happened there. Massive use of technology will deliver on that. But at the same time, we also know that massive use of technology led to a lot of the polarization that happened in the case. So I will say, and I will be with the ambassador on this, that the one thing we might have as the ultimate, the ultimate switch is that we have the ability to carry on with philosophical and ethical standards. And that will be and might remain to be the last distinction between humans and the machines at one point. Let's hope that we're going to be able to manage this process better than the way recent events seems to suggest. Thank
you. I know that the time is running out and I already spoke too much. So very briefly, first, I have no doubt that all the new high-tech technologies and the artificial intelligence will have a role to play in the resolution of the conflicts. And in different phases, it's very difficult to predict in what phases. What I would, at this stage, where I see useful use of these new technologies is first to deal with the causes, root causes of the conflict, poverty, dysfunctional states, exclusion of groups. So if you can apply this, that helps the mediator and the mediation effort to come to a peaceful solution. The second, I see, how they can protect the space for the mediator, for a mediator, to do the mediation. And this is very important, not just from the point of security, but also how to distinguish between, false and true information, how to get others connected, how to, protect the parties and yourself as a mediator from these negative influences. So in these two areas, I see that, artificial intelligence and other high technologies can make a already significant contribution. I would put special emphasis on the issues of poverty and issue of justice. But how, whether one day a machine can replace a mediator, for me, it's very difficult to see this happening. And the main point, maybe, I will be, easily overruled or, by tech experts. But the main point is, even as a foreign policy, expert, we all refrain from making any prediction even for the next 5 minutes. When you are faced with a situation, you prepare yourself for this situation. But, you don't do forecasting, you don't do prediction, because everything you do is based on your knowledge, on your personal feelings, and on the current state of affairs. And that changes in a minute. So if we are to form an algorithm, how machine is going to change this algorithm? If they cannot feel this, if you cannot feel the atmosphere in the room, if you cannot see that, two parties which refuse to talk to each other just rub their shoulders and said sorry. These are all signs which are very important. You jump on this, door opens a little bit, you try to open more. So, and you have a crisis. For example, whenever we had a crisis, it was the best opportunity to advance solutions. Is machine going on the basis of the data and the algorithms? Is machine going to be able to recognize this and to use it? I don't know. But for me, it's very difficult to see a machine replacing a human mediator. But we'll wait and see. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. All that remains for me to do is to thank our 3 speakers for joining us today, for sharing their insights, their experience, their ideas. So Diego, Milos, Enrico, thank you so much for taking the time and being with us today. Also, thank you to our audience for staying with us and staying with us over time. It was an absolute pleasure to see your comments in the chat and to bring your questions and comments into the debate. The next web debate will be next month, so if you have time, it would be fantastic to see you again with a new topic then. For now, thank you to everyone, and we will follow up as usual with the recording. And
thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Katarina, and everybody else. Thank you.